This is Milagro Castilleja here with a small programming note. Due to technical difficulties, part of the video portion of the podcast was lost and unable to be recovered. For this episode only, we have a partial video recording of the podcast. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy.
Welcome to the AskBYS Podcast, a monthly podcast brought to you by Bainbridge Youth Services and its supporting sponsors. AskBYS Podcast connects parents to professionals that can provide support, education, resources on a public topic in parenting. The speaker's words and opinions are their own and do not represent the policies or opinions of BYS. I am your host, Jessica Crook, and am here with Milagro Castilleja as our producer. We are recording live in the Media Arts Studio at BARN, the Bainbridge Artisan Resource Network. Today's parent guest is Bainbridge Island resident Brittany Murphy, mother of 4.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
And our professional guest, Dr. Kathleen Wolf, a research social scientist and mother of a daughter born and raised on BI.
Jessica, thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Thank you all for both being here. Today's episode is nature and its effect on our children and their development. A conversation around the value of implementing credible research findings about the connection between young people, nature, and health, and the impact of these findings. With that, I'll hand this off to you, Brittany.
Thanks, Jessica. As Jessica said, I am a mother. I have a couple other hats that I'd like to mention just because it's important in how I show up today. I feel like mentioning that I'm a lifelong student is really important because I am a huge advocate for learning and the growth mindset. I am a professional therapist. I work with multiple populations. Most recently, I've worked with incarcerated individuals. I've worked with adolescents with the University of Washington experiencing PTSD symptoms post-COVID, which was invaluable, and I learned a ton from them, probably more so than they did me. And currently, I'm working with Mindful Therapy Group, serving individuals in the greater Seattle area. One thing that I think would be really valuable in bringing us all together in this conversation as a space of gratitude and recognition would be a land acknowledgement. Throughout my master's program with Antioch University, I was most struck by the psychological, not so much the psychological material presented, but more the intentional ways that professors took time in aligning their information or their appreciation of the space, the time, and their perception of it, and how they presented. So I would like to spend some time with my own land acknowledgement here. We acknowledge that Bainbridge Island is within the Aboriginal territory of the Suquamish people. Historically, the Suquamish people are expert fishermen, canoe builders, and basket weavers. They live in harmony with lands and waterways along Washington's Salish Sea, as they have for thousands of years. Here they live and protect the land and waters of their ancestors for future generations. Thank you. I appreciate that space. I think the greater community has a somewhat ingrained sense of nature being important. I don't want to say it from a topical standpoint. I will say from a I'm not sure the word I want for that. It's not a very honed in or focused. It's kind of a background. How can I say that?
So maybe I can help with that. First of all, Brittany, thank you for the land acknowledgement, because there's so much embedded in an acknowledgement with regard to how people connect to, relate to, and their dependence on nature. So I think we might be returning to that time and time again during our time together here. But as far as nature in the background, I am semi-retired after working at the University of Washington for about 30 years. And my work has been in the social sciences of nature and psychology, environmental psychology. So my studies have involved how people relate to nature, perceptions, preferences, behaviors. And over the last decade, it has focused on nature and health response, human health response. And what we see in the research, and throughout this talk, our time together, I'll tend to reference research because I continue to monitor the publications that are happening all over the world, as well as my own work. But what we see is so many people, nature is simply something in the background. It's taken for granted. It's our subsistence. It's the source of our everyday needs. It's the source of our renewal psychologically, and yet for many people it's simply in the background and not recognized.
I love the way you said that, and that resonates with me so deeply. And it is something that is a huge, I have to intentionally bring it into my focal point. You know, I remind myself to look up when I go outside. I remind myself to put the phone in the pocket and when I'm walking with my kids, so I'm not doing earbuds, right? Because there are so many very readily available things that distract us from putting our feet on the ground, breathing a deep breath of fresh air, feeling where our body needs to move and where it needs to not. And I want to instill that in my children. And I want to model that for not only my children, but the community at large, because I do think it's something that has been forgotten.
So your personal activity, behavior, observations are so aligned with the research that I'm aware of. And I'll just say, I will, as we're talking in this conversation, I'll sprinkle in some of the experiences that I've had in addition to conducting research. And one of the most recent is this phenomenal opportunity. I was invited to South Korea to visit and learn about forest bathing stations. And the Ministry of Forestry in South Korea has set up 20 plus forest bathing stations around the nation. And what these do, or what they're intended to do, is they offer opportunity to simply come and connect in the way that you just described, by way of water, by way of touching soil, by way of walking through forests, by way of becoming intentional, becoming mindful within that space. And one doesn't have to travel to Korea or outside the city or beyond our island community. As you just described, you can have those experiences in your own backyard, or in your own streetscape, or in one of the many parks and green spaces that we have on Bainbridge Island. And another thing is the research demonstrates that people of all ages, I know that we're perhaps focusing on young people, children, adolescents, youth here, but across all ages, the research is demonstrating phenomenal benefit. And we could talk, a little more specifics of some of those benefits if that fits our conversation.
Yeah, well, the first thing that popped into my head was how healing water can be. For so many cultures, it is at the forefront of healing. Touching the ground and spending time outside is very not only psychologically beneficial, but also on a very biological basis. Our body responds to that time and that space. And what came up in my head when you were talking was how medically we are counteracting this natural flow by our sedentary lifestyle, our lack of being outside, our focus on technological improvement and advancement in this era is so much of our daily. Whereas stretching and taking a full deep breath, like I was saying, or even just putting our naked feet in the water and feeling the stones or the dirt or the silt, whatever's there, we don't get that. And our bodies are reacting to that medically.
And so now I'm going to dip into being the science geek here a little bit. And that is, as I have been doing research and then monitoring the research of a community of science now that is all over the world. These publications are coming from nations on every continent, many, many nations. And often when I speak to people about nature and health research, it's like, oh, that's interesting. Isn't that new? It's been going on for 40 years, and there are thousands of articles. So let me just give kind of a surface treatment, if you will, or a surface description. What I see across this research is really two main themes. One is wellness, promoting wellness, nature experiences. The other is therapy. And what do I mean by that? What we see in the research is that if someone is feeling generally well, but, with occasional days where you're a little blue, a little down, or you're feeling stressed, or maybe, you got a virus, you're down for a few days, having routine nature experiences, and that's what's important, not one and done, like a long vacation, but routine, every day, frequently. There are some studies now about nature dosage. How much is optimal? 20 minutes or so seems to be where we're landing, and about 120 minutes a week, not unlike physical activity recommendations. So wellness. Nature experiences help promote wellness, just maintaining good health, psychologically, physically. But then others of us, and sometimes this happens at different times of our lives, a clinical diagnosis. It might be psychological, say depression, or it might be physical, like a surgery recovery or recovery from cancer treatment. There we see studies that also show that routine experiences of nature help in healing and help us to get better again. And so what you're describing personally and your time with children, your time with your kids, is borne out by research, and water being an element of that. There are landscape preference studies that date back to, again, 4 decades. And what is one of the elements that routinely appear as high preference and high benefit? Water. Viewing water, being in water, contact with water, so important. Also, big trees.
Yes.
And in so many communities, we're losing big trees. The idea in development is, well, we can take them down and we can replant, but we're not replanting those things that will get the large stature that provide the benefits and really ground us. I mean, talking about your land, back to your land acknowledgement, large fully formed ecosystem, forest ecosystems are so important, and they're important for our contact as well as ecological health.
Do you think that you named large, and when I think of the word large, I think of tall in being part of that, their stature. My curiosity is the height an important element? And in that question, I mean, do we need to be able, like I was saying, to remind myself to look up, right? I said that earlier. That they're bigger than us. We are smaller than, we're not the biggest thing in the community. There is something larger than us, more substantial than us. Does that put us in our place a little bit psychologically, do you think, or even physically, to be able to know that we are not the end-all, be-all?
What I'm already detecting in this conversation is you're helping me put together a list of new research questions. And so let me take a stab at what you just said. The research really hasn't explored, if you will, the nuances of large trees.
Okay.
But what comes to mind is, first of all, research about biodiversity. So what we're seeing is general experiences of nature improve psychological health. They help reduce stress, they help reduce anxiety. As I mentioned, clinical depression studies are showing that time walking outdoors in forest areas helps reduce depression. But biodiversity adds another little margin, another little increment of benefit is what I'm seeing. And it's only a handful of studies, but ecologists are starting to now collaborate with public health officials and social scientists in this sort of research. So biodiversity, which may get at your question about larger trees and looking up into the canopy. Another aspect of research that comes to mind is nature connectedness. There's a lot more attention to what is our emotional and effective connection to nature. And there are measures called nature connectedness studies or instruments, if you will. So I suspect that nature connectedness is influenced by the sorts of things, the experiences that you described. And I'll bring one last topic into this, place attachment. I've become more interested lately in my research in place attachment. And that is, we have places, nature objects, experiences in nature that inform who we are and how we view the world and how we interact with other people. And while the place attachment research has been out for decades, it started with our attachment to home and immediate community. But I'm seeing ever more research about nature, nearby nature, as a place attachment element and how it supports health, because that's a crucial part of who we are.
Oh, that's very interesting. What that brings to mind for me is I'm reading a book by Jonathan Haidt, not H-A-T-E, but H-A-I-D-T, about the anxious generation. It's talking about Gen Z, right? Our most recent generation coming, having the most depression and the most anxiety diagnosed in the therapeutic world, and why. And his standpoint is that in 2010, we introduced the smartphone, which fundamentally changed our connection with the world, our connection with the space we're in, our connection with the people around us. And in that, we don't pay attention to the ground we're walking on because we're listening to the thing on the phone. We're not paying attention to the eye contact that we're making with folks, or the body language, or the subtle nuances of a conversation aren't happening. And because of that, our brains are checking out, right? One statement I really like is, neurons that fire together wire together, right? And it goes along with, if you don't use it, you lose it. Well, we're really not using our critical thinking to solve problems in nature. How am I going to climb that tree? I've met kids that don't know how to climb a tree. Never had the thought that they would climb a tree. And that to me is so soul shaking, and that's where I'm like, how can the research lead us to remember these things? And that's kind of what I'm hearing you say, is research is very much at the forefront of the Western civilization understanding this, because if we look anywhere outside, I feel like so many communities and so many different ways of the world already practice this. This has been around forever. It's not new. But it feels to so many of us on a very communal basis that this information is new. So I guess the question I'm positing is, how is this new information? Because, Eastern civilizations have been embodying it, practicing it, using it. Western medicine is one version, but Eastern medicine has been around forever. Why is it that it is new to us?
I think what you're talking about is a sense of renewal, because as Western societies, I believe that we have had the nature connection in the past, though there are philosophical and frankly economic systems that have, encouraged or reinforced our separation. So again, dipping into research, what are some thoughts about this? Frankly, I rely on my phone, I have to say. I use it. I rely on it. I use it to encounter the world. But I've also sought to balance that with time outdoors away from that phone. And I think pursuing that balance is where we're at. And here's a thought about that. Again, we're sponsored here by a youth services organization. I'm working with a group of people, actually a couple of different projects. We're attempting to introduce forest therapy to college students because they are so stressed now. As you mentioned, COVID, people working on screens, including college students, and the after-COVID effects are deeply felt by college administrators as well as the students. So there's one project at Trinity University in Texas, and it's a team education students who are training to become teachers. And they are facing a profession that has a very high burnout right now. So what my colleagues are introducing is forest therapy as a prescribed activity. So while the curriculum includes pedagogy, how do you teach, what is your content material, they're also introducing self-care by way of forest therapy. And so there are forest therapy guides now, there are certification systems, but a key piece of it, rather than going into a deep dive on that, a key piece of it is what they're finding is the students in their journaling about the forest therapy is sit spots. So the students are encouraged to find a place on campus and to go to that sit spot and literally do that. Sit for 30 minutes. Look, listen, breathe, feel wind on your face, wind on your skin. Watch birds, clouds, whatever it might be. And what they're finding is in the journals, the students are relating just the power of sit spots. They're first impatient. What am I doing here? I got to pull out my phone. But over time, they come to cherish this activity. I'll take us sideways into another aspect of this, and one of the longest held theories about nature and health, particularly in the psychological sense, is attention restoration theory, forwarded by Rachel and Stephen Kaplan at the University of Michigan. They were my mentors in grad school. And attention restoration theory posits that you gain benefit, stress reduction, anxiety reduction, while being in nature, nearby nature, just outside your door, outside your window, in very brief amounts of time. There are several sub-principles of that, but I'll mention one, and that is soft fascination. So our lives, including looking at phones and screens, we're the attention demand of processing, as you mentioned, the neurobiology of processing all that content, all that material, we're depleted. We're cognitively depleted. And then we have less impulse control. We're seeing that in young people who are looking at phones constantly, screens. Less impulse control, less ability to concentrate on what's important, more ADHD, and so on. So attention restoration theory, there are several elements, but one is soft fascination, because being in nature, looking at nature, draws us in without effort. Soft fascination, again, the wind. There's a term for the sound and viewing of wind in the trees called sough, S-O-U-G-H. And I've taken that in as, can I find sough today, at least, in a temporary way. So soft fascination is what helps us to recover from that time. Again, finding balance in the use of our phones and screens and all of that draws us in.
There's so much about what you just said. I love that. Your definition of sitting in nature with no intention other than that is so incredibly important. And I think what you said there, it made me think of building internal motivation. You said with no focus other than whatever it is that's in front of you, just to explore with all of your five senses what you're seeing, feeling, smelling, looking at. And that too, in my psychological brain, makes me think, you're building that internal motivation and critical thinking skill that so often we miss those opportunities, our young people specifically. If you ask them to think critically, we freeze. We don't know what that means because we have this instantaneous gratification at our fingertips. I'll just ask Google. I'll just look it up. Why don't you touch it and smell it and then tell me what you think that looks like, that shared experience of a conversation and what you think a perception of something versus my perception of something is how we build community. And I loved what you said about
I'll just jump in if I might.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think where we're both moving with my understanding of this research in again semi-retired. I continue to collaborate with teams and write and travel and talk, but I am moving to so what? What does all of this mean in terms of the theoretical or empirical understanding? And so I'm becoming far more interested in recommendations for built space. My master's degree, while the PhD was environmental psychology, the master's degree was a professional degree in landscape architecture. So I'm very rusty and not on top of, sort of latest design principles, but I have kind of a general idea of how you create quality space. And what is important to me now is not only the screen demands, if you will, for children, but we have taken away the places where people and children in particular can experience nature. So number one is, how do we build, even in our schoolyards, how do we build in more nature? And that's another project I've been working on with Seattle Children's Hospital and the Trust for Public Land, a series of schoolyard to parks, community parks conversions in Tacoma. And that's what we're attempting to do, is to take places that are largely paved or just very large lawn areas and convert them to more nature-based schoolyards that also serve as community parks after hours. And so that's one aspect of this, is how do we make more spaces where people are comfortable, safe, and can experience nature in these ways. The other is, how do we introduce programming? So just to say, hey, there's a place, go find your sit spot, doesn't work very well. So forest therapy guides, I'm hearing now about schools that are actually hiring certified forest therapy guides to introduce students and teachers, staff as well, to forest therapy as a routine practice. Starting with the school, but take it home. Introduce it to your parents. Introduce it to other loved ones, friends, and so on. And I'll mention a resource. You mentioned a book. I'll mention a resource that listeners might be interested in, and that is the Children and Nature Network. So a number of years ago, Richard Louv wrote a book, Last Child in the Woods, and he and his fellow advocates said, we've got to do more, following this book. So they created this website and society, if you will, called Children in Nature Network. There's an annual conference. The website is fantastic because it has resources. It has latest research, and the research is summarized in a way that people generally can read it and share it with others. It has program ideas, successful programs that people have done, and there's small write-ups about the programs. And it's a general community of advocacy for the sorts of things that we're talking about. So it's a great resource for anyone who would like to dip in a little bit more about all of this.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned Richard Louv. I've read that book you're referring to, and it's excellent. Just the way he speaks about nature, it's very moving. And I'm really glad you found where I was trying to put myself, and that was that we have to build it in. Right? It's not something that's going to fall in our laps like the phone or the technology. It's not something that is going to bombard us with decision-making and lots of colorful and explosive glitter all over the screen. It's something that we have to be intentional about and put in front of us on purpose, whether it's our schools or our home life or our time spent with family. It's a decision that we intentionally have to make. And you said a lot of programs that are building it into schools. Islandwood here on Bainbridge has an incredibly beautiful educational program, and you can go and do your master's program there. You can go and be part of a camp during the summer. So it serves many different groups, and their biodiversity there and the way that they share information is so informative and so welcoming and inclusive. I really, really love that space. Yeah.
I might add one other sector, and that is health, our healthcare services. What a recent development, maybe 10 years or so, based on the research, because the medical community is very committed to best available science. But there are now doctors doing parks prescription.
No kidding.
And so one of my colleagues, Dr. Robert Czar, he started out in Washington, D.C. He's now in Canada, but he has been the founder of Parks RX. And so it's a network of physicians, healthcare workers generally, that are willing to say, we're doing an exam here, and I see, maybe you're a bit overweight, or maybe you're feeling, anxiety and stress. Let's try a nature prescription. There is now an entire network of healthcare providers generally. I have one kid. She grew up here on Bainbridge, went K-12 through the school system. She is now a physician assistant. Just several months ago, she graduated, and she's now a physician assistant. She's working in Alaska and Juneau, and she loves emergency medicine. But so we have these discussions about what I know and what she's come to know. And while there's a lot of resistance yet in the healthcare industry, it's like, oh, what is this nature therapy stuff? There are doctors who are on board. There are nurses, practitioners who are on board. And so we can start to talk, I think, about Park's prescription, and the research is following that. There are studies now evaluating the effectiveness of Park's prescription as it's part of a patient's chart, so you can actually look at before and after and how they're responding. So I find that a really exciting development in all of this.
I do too. I'm curious to hear from your daughter's perspective what conversations look like for folks that are being prescribed a nature prescription.
And she hasn't had that opportunity. She worked in healthcare, bless her. She worked in this hospital in the mental health unit during COVID. Some of her stories, I won't go there, but some of her stories, come home after work, can't go out because the hospital's policy is you will not socialize because we don't want you bringing in the virus. Frankly, her dog, she's got this big mutt of a dog, that I think was her psychological health
Right.
savior. Anyway, we talk about this, and during COVID, she said to her supervisor, we got this little bit of space outdoors here. We could create a healing garden. And they said, are you kidding? We don't have money. What? No. So I think that's a conversation that's still far too common in many healthcare facilities. On the other hand, there are some hospital systems that have phenomenal healing gardens. The Legacy Hospital System in Portland, there's a woman who is a horticulture therapist there, Teresa Hazen. She also is retired but still quite active. They have a series of health and healing gardens for children, around the cancer treatment area, around the mental health unit, around the burn unit. And so those pioneers, if you will, in all of this, the healthcare providers that are prescribing nature experiences in and around your own home, your own community, as well as those people that are endorsing healing facilities, I think it will only expand. I think there's now effort on the part of health and nature researchers such as myself. I'm a founding member of the Nature and Health Alliance, which is an international alliance of researchers doing this work. We're now attempting to contact insurers, if insurers come around and actually pay for people as patients that nature is a part of their treatment. Can you imagine what sort of fiscal support there would be for creating more nature in our communities and around our healthcare facilities? That is such a big leap, and that's what we're attempting to. We're trying to get that crack in the door, right, and step into that.
Oh, that is a beautiful segue to legislature. But before I mention that, I want to ask you, you mentioned that the cancer unit specifically has a healing space at the Legacy Hospital.
Yes.
My curiosity is there anything in the research recently that speaks to the healing power of nature, green spaces, with cancer, biologically speaking?
All right, there's two, kind of a before and after. And again, all that I'm speaking about, I am but one person doing this research. large community. I mentioned large community of science. So there may be things going on that I'm not aware of, but here's what I have been reading about. The first is some of the best research about the physiology, how our bodies respond to nature experiences, has come out of South Korea and Japan. That has expanded, but that's where a lot of it came from originally. And that's why, frankly, now both Japan and South Korea have these networks of forest bathing stations. But one really interesting premise is that by being in nature and perhaps taking in phytoncides, which are those compounds that trees emit that are in the air, they're volatile, we take them in, it may influence our immune system in ways. Natural killer cells is the generic term for it. You know, they've got a very long string, multi-syllable name, but natural killer cells may be those things that prevent cancers from taking off and becoming more robust in our bodies. So there's the front end. The back end is chemo and other treatments, surgery and whatnot, are incredibly inducing with people. Yes, you're psychologically also responding to cancer diagnosis and treatment. And there's some studies showing that nature experiences was part of the treatment regime, helps reduce stress, helps restore cognitive ability, so you're maybe better understanding what's happening to you and the treatments that are being provided to you. So there's a physiological dimension to this as well as a cognitive psychological dimension.
You made that so digestible. I love the way you said that. For a moment, I want to ask if we can talk a little bit about, you spoke about a cognitive and a physiological understanding, and that made me think of how we come to understand or to know anything. Specifically, we're talking about nature. So I was reading a book by Leonard Sachs, who I am a huge fan of, and it's called Boys Adrift. And it's talking about how in this day and age, our boys are asked to sit still for 6 hours a day in school. We're telling them to be quiet, all this rote memorization. But again, we go back to the lack of experiential learning. And I have a curiosity about where children are learning things. Are we teaching them what we are hoping to teach them in schools, or is social media taking over and they're learning more from their devices than they are from eye contact, conversation, shared space where they have body language and subtle nuances that maybe aren't being picked up on? The social, emotional environment that they are in, are they missing so much of it that it is causing them to be more anxious, more depressed? Any research that you have found to be really beneficial or glean any light in that arena?
Your question is above my pay grade. I'll just say. But again, a few thoughts come to mind from this research that I monitor. One is, and Richard Louv, I think, really called this out well, and the Children in Nature Network. There are, an ongoing community of scientists and investigators that are exploring these ideas. But the value of nature, particularly for young children, so informal learning. There are forest schools, forest preschools that are incredibly popular. And Seattle had one of the earliest networks of forest schools, and now it's taken off all over the country, in the world, frankly. And these are places where there is some level of formal learning for very young children. But the concept is being outdoors as much as is possible, weather permitting. And in that outdoor space, again, it's safe, it's secure, people are comfortable to a reasonable degree. These children are learning cooperation. They're learning creativity. I mean, think about, I was a feral child, what Richard Louv called a feral child, right? It was a different era, decades ago. But I was out playing with sticks, and I was out in a neighborhood stream, and, all of my friends, we were building forts. So, but there was a lot of cooperation built into that, the social dynamics. There was a lot of creativity of what do we want to do in a very simplistic way, but nonetheless, what are the steps to get there? There was associated with formal learning, counting, colors, textures, all those things that become the fundamentals of more abstract learning as we get older. And so what you are asking about, I can't speak to firsthand, but I think, this idea of the sit spot and the mindfulness and the soft fascination, those are the things that reinforce. And the stress reduction. Roger Ulrich is another, early on, another environmental psychologist, very, very influential work. And what he found is in a laboratory setting, inducing stress in people in this laboratory setting, and then some people viewed urban, lots of buildings, built settings, and then others viewed nature settings. The charts are amazing. Within seconds, the physiological stress reduction is reduced. I would posit that if you are physiologically more relaxed, if you are more open to mindfulness and what's around you, you are more open to learning. You are more open, you are in a better condition to understand what's happening around you, how to process that, how to engage with others. And I'll just circle back to your land acknowledgement and the acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples. I think that's what we're beginning to learn. So I speak from a Western science perspective. Intellectually, that's what I was brought up in, and that's how I continue to practice. But I've been interacting with teams of people more about Indigenous and local knowledge. And that, if we take in and bring to science, if you will, Indigenous science into all of this, we start to see the reciprocity, we start to see the holism of what we're trying to understand and how we engage with it. And that may include devices, because frankly, a lot of the tribal people I work with on various committees and teams, they've got those devices as well, but they seem to have a sense of when to put that aside, when to celebrate culture, when to celebrate at all, and when to engage with their surroundings. And, how do we bring that all in to who we are and what we do?
Yeah, and I think what I want to scream out loud is we have to have those conversations. We have to talk about what that balance looks like and what it feels like. Check in with ourselves, If I'm on my screen all day, what does that do to me? What am I thinking, feeling, smelling, seeing, and what am I not? And have those conversations with our children and with our greater community to bring that balance more to the forefront, like we were talking about. Nature should not be a backstory. It should be in and among us in everything that we do, and for it to be part of the conversation. As human beings, our experience through language is that's how we organize and learn and come to understand the world around us. That's how we perceive everything that we allow to be or that we are existing within. And without the language paired with what we see or smell or hear, I feel like we're missing a big piece of the conversation and the community building aspect of language.
And what you're describing, again, as later career and my turn to taking theory and attempting to make it more tangible, to, what are the places or programs that we create? Some of the things we're talking about are very big and rather overwhelming. So what I try to do by modeling and by presentation is to start small. Mm-hmm. I would say our school systems, and a caveat here. My husband is an educator, started out as a high school teacher. He was actually on faculty at Islandwood for a number of years. And now he is doing consulting STEM education. He is helping elementary school teachers to become more effective science teachers by way of workshops and curriculum development. So we talk about this a lot, is you have big goals, but starting small and building incrementally is really important. So, for people who are listening now, be it young people, be it their parents, be it older people in the community like myself, what are some small things that we can do? Go for a walk and invite others. That's another thing that we see in this research, is if people are really busy or they're uncertain, if someone, a mentor, if someone says, let's go for a walk, that starts things. When I was working at the University of Washington, I was a bike commuter. And so I rode my bike to UW, Ferry, UW campus, 14 years, all through the year, winter. The clothing tech is so good, you can actually do that now and do it comfortably. But on occasion, people would say, oh, this is great, Kathy, I'd like to do this, but what? And I would mentor them. I would say, here's the stuff. Here's what I wear. This is the kind of bike you might want. Oh, yeah, I'll show you the route. And we would ride a route for a day or two. And so they would see how this happens. And maybe that's what we all need to be advocates, but not in a big global, big scale way, but to say, how can I bring someone along in a small way and help introduce them to these ideas? And then how do we create community around this? And so the Bainbridge Youth Services, maybe there's a program encouraging. I noticed there's a nice little forest parcel outside the building. Maybe introduce this idea of a sit spot. Maybe hire a forest therapy guide once in a while to offer a session for young people. And I've seen this happen. Initially, there's that's kind of woo-woo. And then there's curiosity. And then there's, I want to do this. And then they become advocates. So figuring out how to build a trajectory of community around all of this.
I like that. Starting small. A lot of the folks that I work with have this existential doom. They're coming in with this already mounted anxiety about environment and the degradation of the world. And that is where I start, is I say, what is one thing you can do today in your circle of influence that can make you feel good, and then maybe somebody else can see you feeling good. And I think, like you said, it starts there, and you can extrapolate that to bigger and broader. I am not visiting Korea this year, as you have, but I imagine that wasn't your first year process either. You've created a network now because of the places that you find passion and interest, and now you have these opportunities that are more grandiose. And just to remind people that it starts with, a conversation about how to wear certain things in riding your bicycle, And
again, from a research perspective, so I retired about 2.5 years ago, and there's, one is so involved in your career and everyday demands, and we've talked about screens and what feeds to you, and then there's that day, and it's kind of a cliff because there's a lot of discussion about approaching that point, but there's not a lot about what happens after. And so, being again a science geek, I've been reading a lot about the research about retirement, and a sense of purpose is so important to mental health, and it gives you an outlook on life. And so kind of the spiral outward is, all right, older people in purpose, what about younger people? So across this literature, from cradle to grave, what we see is nature and health benefit, and we also see the importance of purpose for mental health. And again, it doesn't have to be grand scale. It can be, what do I want to achieve? What's important? How do I bring others to it? But purpose, apparently, across a number of studies, appears to be really important for psychological health and momentum. keeping yourself active and what's important. I've learned that in retirement. All right, so in retirement, there are 3 general stages that people talk about, and that is go-go, which I hope I'm still there, slow-go, and no-go. And so most young people, my daughter, probably your kids, probably, many of the listeners here are definitely go-go. Lots of activity, lots of energy, but around that, how do you wrap purpose? How do you give it direction? And I think that's what, you talk about the brain rot and a feeling of doom about the earth. How do you build some purpose into that to keep yourself motivated and psychologically more healthy? And something about nature, a purpose with regard to nature, I find really is beneficial for a lot of people, be they go or no-go.
Right. That's an excellent point. I love the way you broke that down because it gives me an idea of how to take myself out of that go-go. I'm very much in that stage, right? It is a life stage that I am immersed in. And for me to recognize that there is another way, like I don't always have to be that. And it may not be the healthiest way for me to be all the time, right? That feeds into that chronic stress that often we hear. But to know that I could just be, what was the middle one?
Slow
go. How beautiful could that be, right?
Yeah.
That's where I am in nature. That's where I really find that deep breath and that space to just be. And in those places, I feel like I am enough. I am doing enough. I don't need to plan. I don't need to organize my calendar. I can just look. And that feels so all-encompassing in such a great way. I feel so nourished after going on a hike with my kids or riding bikes and getting dirt on my face from the one in front of me. It's so important to remind myself that slow go is more than okay. Sometimes that's healthier. And for me to no-go is almost impossible. I am neurodivergent myself. I have ADHD, so to sit in a room with no windows, stagnant, feels very unnatural, right? But to recognize the importance in that slowing down and just breathing in and out is a health benefit that I need to partake in on a daily basis.
And I'll emphasize, I don't know that we've talked about it, sort of the character of nature that's a value for health benefits. And traveling around the world, I have to say, different conferences. I've actually done a couple of sabbaticals in Japan. And North Americans, we are prone to thinking nature benefit only happens in big, dramatic landscapes outside cities. The idea that you have to get away from it all. But my focus has been on nearby nature, that nature which is around us everywhere, or can be. Not everyone has that. That's another dimension of nature and health that's now quite prominent, is equity. It used to be that in a city, a community, a neighborhood, if they didn't have trees or parks, it was no big deal. It's about beautification. No, we now know how profoundly important it is for people to have nearby nature. So how do we convince people you don't have to take a long time away, but creating these spaces around your home, your own garden. I've done that in my own home garden, in your community, in your neighborhood, on your school campus. How do we do this more effectively? And there's very good design guidelines for that. One can find, you Google design for nature and health, all sorts of great ideas, from very small spaces to larger, whatever you might have to work with. So scale is important, and emphasizing that nearby is the most beneficial in terms of health.
Right. I'm so glad we got to privilege, because you can't talk about nature without talking about privilege. And you mentioned green spaces is all about beautification and how do we build in this natural look to our scape, but that it also has to do with equity, right? And in my bachelor's program, I took an environmental sciences course, which is going to sound very mundane to you, I imagine, but there's value in the idea that every single person has a right to live near a park, to have trees that are taller than them, to have patches of grass they can put their feet in. And there was an environmental act that was passed in relation to this. We weren't being equitable with our spaces. We were putting lots of lower income folks living next to toxic waste dumps, right, in larger cities, and we didn't focus on any environmental justice whatsoever. And there was lots of lawsuits that happened. There was one in Oregon 4 years ago by a 15-year-old kid that won, and he sued the Environmental Protection Act because we weren't living up to the standards and regulations that we had professed that we would meet by 2050 or something to that effect. And I think the visibility that he created is so powerful, and it brings me back to that idea that, like, we as I will say an upper middle class, I guess, here, don't look at privilege often. And a lot of the other world, large cities, have to. My curiosity for you is, in your research, when you break it down to, like you were saying, personal gardens, time spent in the dirt with your own hands, is that enough for people to create their own sense of equity if it's not being offered to them in the greater community scale?
I'm going to pull apart your comments just a little bit. And the first is, we have had environmental regulations in our nation now for decades. And those have tended to, as you mentioned, those have tended to address toxins and risk in the environment. And understanding also the inequities of where sources of these toxins have been placed historically. And so, we've got a Superfund site right here in our own community on Bainbridge Island, and there are others in the Seattle area. Those are focused on recognizing the injustices and then eliminating these materials that are detrimental to health. What we've been talking about is what is termed salutogenic health, and that is the benefit provided by having nature. In other words, having healthy, well-functioning ecological diversity, perhaps, and that's a balance then between the toxigenic and the salutogenic, if you will. Yeah. And so the term that I'm hearing in part for equity in not having salutogenic and not having trees, not having parks, even if the whole toxin situation is either not there or has been remedied. Those are two different things going on, two different dynamics. And the term I'm hearing for this is nature deprivation. And so there are many communities, cities, City of Seattle, for instance, that is formally and directly addressing the absence of nature in certain communities. South Seattle, for instance, is pretty typical. And the dilemma there is, what are our property values now? I grew up in Tacoma. What I see for house purchase prices is unimaginable to me as someone who was a young adult growing up in Tacoma. And so there are not affordable properties to purchase for parks, to purchase the spaces to plant a forest grove. So we have to be a little more creative about how do we dedicate nature for benefit. And the schoolyard project that I worked on in Tacoma is exactly about that. Schoolyards are underserved. Children during the school day, yes, highly, lots of activity, but there's restriction, even discouragement of use of that land after hours and on weekends. Maybe less so here on Bainbridge Island, but certainly in many other communities. So the Children in Nature Network, one of their major policy directives is how do we create green schoolyards? How do we convert these places to workable and accessible parks? Another set of projects that I've been involved with, not so much anymore, but in the past, is green stormwater infrastructure.
Oh, yes.
Okay, we're putting in bioswales, rain gardens, and their primary function is an engineering function. Manage water so that it's not going into drains and pipes and overwhelming this engineered system. Think of those little installations as micro-parks. Just a little bit of tweak in the design, a bench, a trail, an edge. They can become these nearby nature they can fulfill a nearby nature potential. Again, on Bainbridge Island, I see that happening to some extent. For some other communities around our nation, that is a mind blower. It's like, what? The engineers becoming parks creators? It's a major cognitive dissonance.
Yes.
The way we talk about this.
Right. I'm so glad you mentioned that. That was one of my biggest research projects, was to write a grant for stormwater drain systems, and the extent and the amount of powerful brains that go into 10 by 10 space is mind-blowing, as you said. But it is so incredible how many different layers that speaks to. It speaks to taking care of the water. It speaks to the mental health of the people that live around that area. It speaks to the transportation usability in that space. There's so much to it, and it breaks down, and it's very, very simple. Here's 5 plants, here's the dirt, here's the grass, and it takes very little effort and money to do it or to maintain it, even because we live in such a wet space. And the benefit is huge.
Yeah, potentially. And another dimension of this that I've been working on of late with a group at the University of Maryland, the Environmental Finance Center. And we just released a report, technical report, and what we are promoting, we also worked with the American Planning Association. We're promoting that nature in cities be thought of as a system. Not as a scattered park here, some trees there, street tree planting there, but think of it as a health promoting system. What do we mean? Think about our transportation system. There are very explicit elements that transportation engineers think of, everything from high-speed highway to the arterial to the road that serves your neighborhood and even your home. There are utility delivery systems, let's say water delivery, huge pipes that convey water, smaller pipes to our streets, smaller pipe to our home. Can we think about nearby nature as a scaled system, not unlike these other utility systems? There are very few places where they have thought of it. Nature in the city has been an accident historically, and maybe has even been diminished, putting streams underground, filling in wetlands, all of these ecological and ecosystem services. The potential has been diminished, including human health associated with nearby nature. So anyway, I'm, again, with a team of people, we're envisioning and talking about how nature as a health-promoting system should become more prominent in city policy. Uh-oh, I just did a mind blow. Huh?
I love that. I'm curious, and now I'm going through all the green spaces in Seattle that I have looked at, right, for the grant. But what I'm thinking is, are you talking about the green spaces that either have been covered up or utilized, right, all of them, as a system in and of themselves, or that they are a system that helps benefit our mental well-being or physical well-being?
Both. Stacked, what we describe this as in a less formal way is co-design for co-benefits. So you can stack these purposes, as you mentioned, the engineering of green stormwater infrastructure. It's very complex because you're talking about volumes and materials and whatnot. But what if part of that stack of purpose is green for nearby nature for health? So thinking about how to stack benefits, the co-design, happening early on, happening as part of the way people are envisioning how the city evolves over time, and infill, and optimizing existing elements that are already there. And here on Bainbridge Island, we have so much potential to do that. I know that the Parks Department is working, the Parks Department, the Land Conservancy, and various organizations are implementing nature elements or conserving nature elements. Our community is really unusual in having this idea of a nature infrastructure. But on the other hand, I'm a little disappointed. Now we have new bike lanes on Madison. No green. Right? That when I should have paid more attention when there were public meetings about, well, what about tree planting or a shrub zone as the what divides that bike lane from the adjacent street. There were opportunities there for green streets or complete streets, and it wasn't part of the discussion, obviously. So if we think about this stack benefits, co-design for co-benefits, with nature being another utility, a bio-utility, if you will, that offers ecosystem services, including human health, it kind of changes up how you do stuff, how you make a city or a community happen. But we're going quite, we're going a little far afield here from young people, students in our schools, children growing up in our community. But ultimately, that's what we're talking about, is a big picture that reinforces nature for health in a way that it becomes part of where we live rather than something we have to do individually, that it becomes part of the larger composition of our homes and our community.
Well, I think bringing it back to your mention of a missed opportunity of green spaces, that is the visual that our kids are getting, and all of us, really. But our kids are a product of their environment as we have been growing up. And if we provide them with an environment that is green, that is integrated, that is connected intentionally, and we are having conversations that maybe they come with us to that city council because we don't have childcare, so you're coming along, and they hear some of the language and the time spent on the topics, it does become part of them. It is, as you were saying, part of the composition that is who they are. And I think that is an incredibly important element. Often we put our kids over here because we're working and we're doing this thing, but there's a lot of my work that I'm very passionate about that my kids can be part of. They can learn about neurobiology at 3, 7, 11. My kids are an array of ages. But age-appropriate information about the environment, about how we as human beings are affecting the environment, from recycling to social and emotional learning and being outside to where they want to maybe travel as they grow up, however grandiose or small scale, whatever they can digest, I think is a great way to, again, you talked about restoration, restoring that in each and every one of us, enlivening it.
And I think we have opportunities, to reflect on what you just said. And again, in a personal way, my daughter, who grew up on this island, and she, my husband and I, dinner table talks, and we're talking about environment and research and whatnot, and her eyes are rolling. She's like, what? And so we had no idea what she would go on to do or become. And she went on to university and she became a wilderness guide in Alaska prior to now her interest in healthcare, because she could see that wilderness guiding with the full winter off was not going to make it work financially. So we have talked, how did this path happen for you? And she told us that it wasn't the dinner table formal talks, it was the time outdoors. It was the activities that were not lesson focused. It was the hikes. It was the turning over the rocks on the beach and looking for the crab scuttle. Yes. And, what are they? And it was the clam digging that we would occasionally do, the foraging. And so, that blend of more formal learning and the experiential, as you described, how do we build that? How do we more effectively build that within our families, within our communities, with our loved ones, and frankly, within our schools? Because my recollection, my daughter going through K-12, particularly high school, so much content emphasis. You got to learn this and this and this and this. And my husband, we've had discussions about the state learning goals. So much content that young people are supposedly provided, and then they have to demonstrate proficiency. But how do we start to balance that with the experiential that you described? Maybe, again, going back to the land acknowledgement, maybe more partnership with our Indigenous neighbors. Maybe something experiential where there is the modeling of this relationship with the earth, with the nature connectedness, with place attachment. There we go. There's another podcast sometime, huh?
Yes. That is so valuable. The idea of free play, right? That is our kids' job. Not learning mathematics and reading and writing. That will come, yes. But our younger children's brains developing where they are, they need to, on a low stakes scale, learn how to make mistakes and fall down and get back up. I mean, that is the governance of the way we operate in the world as grown-ups. But to learn that hierarchy of how loud is my voice? How much does my voice matter? How much am I going to push this information to my friends? And being able to know when to back down and let somebody else take the lead. Those are things that we are missing without that play. And the anxiety, again, is mounting because we're asked to have all of these different ELA and mathematics, and it's all on a screen. I asked if my kid could do his math on a piece of paper, and they said, we don't offer that anymore. We only do all of these, state mandated, what did you call it? Standardized tests, right? We only do that
goals,
online now. And I was like, well, my kid wants to hold the pencil, though. Anyway, so the idea being, not only are we asking them to perform at a much higher level with so many different ways of teaching them in rote form, we're not giving them the opportunity to integrate the information by taking the stick and drawing the numbers in the sand or sliding down the slide and counting to 10 with their friends. We're taking that away and asking them to sit for longer and meet the goals. And I find that is one area where if I could make my voice louder, that would be it. Like, let's take this learning outside. And Montessori schools are doing that. There's a lot of different schools that are implementing that, like the forestry schools. And I find those to be so valuable, and the ways a kid's mind develops to be vastly different in those two different ways of learning.
I'll add maybe one last thought. I think we're nearing the end here. And post-COVID, you've talked about children's learning through screens and adults, frankly, our attention to screens. Post-COVID, there's so many dimensions of recovery, and one is loneliness, social isolation. And that was a public health concern even before COVID, but it's certainly accentuated or increased now. to the point where both England and Japan in their national health systems have ministers of loneliness. There are people actually professionally developing programs to encourage more social connection. And I think that's another opportunity of nature, particularly for young people. Myself, older person, I don't mind being outdoors alone. A solo walk, my sit spot in my yard, I don't mind. But, looking at my daughter, her friends, the social aspect is really important for them. So how can we introduce nature for health in a social way? It might be group walks. It might be some sort of team building. You mentioned Islandwood. They have a lot of team building exercises built in to the programs for the children, the classes that come and attend their week-long visit at Islandwood. So thinking about how to address, again, co-design for co-benefits. Mm-hmm. How do we address loneliness that's being expressed in various psychological ways with our kids, as well as nature experiences for health? And I think that's a big opportunity.
Yes.
Thank you both, Dr. Wolf and Brittany, for allowing BYS to be part of your conversation, and to Barn for providing the studio space. We hope that this conversation proves to be a benefit to you and your parenting. We leave you with the foundation that healthy youth begins with healthy families, and healthy families build healthy communities.